can see me. Okay, thank you. It's okay. All right, so I wanted to show you guys something too. This is my cats right before class started. Aren't they cute? They're hugging. Okay. Um, anyway, they are securely attached to each other. All right, so you can see this. So I want to tell you about a study. This has been replicated a number of times. So I guess probably the one I was originally thinking of when I made this slide was by Megan Gunner, because the next study I'm going to talk about was by Megan Gunner and her colleagues too. So they took kids, like usually the most popular times to study kids are like 12-month-olds, 18-month-olds, and 24 months old to do the strange situation procedure on. And they wanted to compare kids who are securely attached to this group of kids who have what are called disorganized attachments. So there are 4 groups of attachment styles in all. And the first one is, securely attached kids, like the girl that you saw yesterday in the strange situation procedure. And then there are 2 types of insecure attachment. And there's one type that when the caregiver comes back into the room, the child just kind of goes and is dismissive. Okay, and that child also kind of acts like they don't really notice when the caregiver leaves the room. So they're kind of using a pattern, an attachment strategy, and a strategy is kind of dealing with the comings and goings of the person that someone's attached to. And we do this as adults too. And some people kind of go, okay, how I'm going to deal with this is I'm going to pretend that I don't need anyone. So when my caregiver leaves, I'm going to act like I don't care. And when they come back, I'm going to just keep playing or doing whatever I'm doing as though it makes no difference to me. And people kind of do this in adulthood and romantic relationships too. There's all different types of, at least 4 types of having attachment relationships with people that are thought to stem from people's earliest relationships with their caregivers as children. So one of the insecure types is this type that is dismissive, and kind of tries to be kind of like an island, the quote, I don't know where it comes from, no man is an island, meaning that you need more than just yourself. But people who take this dismissive approach are trying to get by on their own, even as babies. And then there's another type of insecurely attached child who, when their mother or father or whoever the caregiver is leaves the room, they look very upset. So they might look at this point like somebody who's securely attached, because remember, securely attached babies cry too, right? But then when the caregiver comes back, they're not really sure. Like they'll kind of approach the caregiver for a reunion hug, kind of like Lindsay or Lucy, I can't make out her name, did yesterday. But they're not really positive it's going to work, so they might kind of duck out right at the last minute. So kind of like psych, and they call this approach avoidant behavior. And I'm sure you've seen this in adults with romantic relationships. It's actually called approach avoidant behavior. And I'm sure you've heard the term mixed messages, or the come here, go away, come here, go away, I love you, I hate you. And that's the type of toddler behavior that that's supposed to come from, that attachment theorists think that's supposed to come from. And those don't look like the perfect ways of being securely attached, but they're still strategies of dealing with being left alone and having somebody come and go. And they keep somebody kind of regulated and organized emotionally. We have a couple people who are not on camera. If at all possible, it'd be great to have you on camera. Um, and then there's one type of attachment that's none of these things. There's no kind of strategy. It's a mixture of the other types of strategies and then just bizarre behavior that's really hard to understand. So some kids who, and they're often kids who've had unstable early childhoods, and and about something like 80% of children who've been abused or neglected turn up to have this type of attachment. It's disorganized attachment. And how they made this category is they originally thought they were three types, these two insecure types, one of which was the dismissive kids who acted like they didn't care, and then the approach avoidant kids who were kind of confused, never knew whether to approach or run away from their parents. And then the secure kids, that's three groups. But then there were all these kids they couldn't classify, and they were putting them in one group called cannot classify. And then they realized there's too many kids in this group. We got to figure out what's going on. And they named it disorganized attachment. And they realized that these tended to be the most at risk kids. And they tended to be the kids who had the most disrupted early relationships with their caregivers. And definitely a high percentage of the kids who had been abused or neglected had this type of attachment, lack thereof. So, Megan Gunner was one person out of many researchers who have, replicated this, who decided to look at, physiological markers of attachment patterns, and was wondering whether there were some kind of stress and you know fight or flight markers for disorganized attachment. Because if you think about it, having a neglected, kind of impoverished early childhood environment, it would make sense that kids' physiological systems would respond to that. If you think about, having heard, never like go up and touch somebody from behind who has a history of trauma, which might scare the heck out of them. Somebody with PTSD has an exaggerated startle response. That's because they're kind of in a hyper vigilant way, always like scanning the horizon, and they're overly kind of primed to look for danger, and their nervous system is just on edge all the time. So what they did was they compared kids with disorganized attachments to kids with all the other types of attachments. And they found that, I mean, well, it says here anyway, but even at baseline, if you're not, I mean, you have to take these levels in the morning, while people are out walking around having their day, and then at nighttime. And I forgot whether, I think it naturally is elevated around bedtime. And they found that kids who who had the disorganized attachments had the normal kind of, like the lowest level in the morning and went up over the course of the day, just like all the other kids in the other three groups. But where they started was a higher level of cortisol. So they are always at a higher level of stress hormone than any of the other three groups. And that would kind of make sense to you, wouldn't it? But, even when nothing was happening, they would. Even when there wasn't a stressful event happening, they would. So what do you think that's about? Why was their cortisol level still higher, even if they weren't being left alone or being hit or hungry, or why would
Um,
it be? Uh-huh.
was it maybe is it because like they're always on like alert just to make sure like, oh, if they're being abused by a parent to be ready
Hmm.
for it?
Yeah. You've heard the term, there's probably some friends or, people that who you're always walking on eggshells around, right? And you find yourself kind of not comfortable when you're around them. And then, when you leave their company, you kind of go, and then you can relax, right? So imagine living with somebody who you don't know if they're going to be really angry at you for no reason at any moment, and you're a little kid and they're an adult, right? So they're constantly on eggshells, and so their nervous system is constantly activated. Um, yeah, so their baseline cortisol levels are higher at all times than the other groups. And then researchers like Megan Gunner, took it even further. And they decided to look at, during the strange situation procedure that I showed you last time, if there were changes in cortisol levels during it. So, how would you expect any kid's cortisol levels to change during the strange situation procedure?
When they go up.
Yeah. Right? Because that's probably like the most stressful thing you can do. I think the peak of attachment behaviors is 18 months. That's when, like, they know who their parent is. They don't want to go to anybody else, and being separated from their parent, like, is not pleasant for them. And so, around that age, if they're in a situation where they're like in a room with a couple people and then all of a sudden everybody leaves, that's going to be really stressful for them. I'm not saying daycare is bad for kids, because that's a different thing. They get used to it, they get to know people there. It's not this sudden, like, abandonment, right? But in the strange situation procedure, it is. It only lasts 3 minutes, so it's not going to do like lasting damage, but it is stressful for them. So yeah, you expect everybody's cortisol level to go up, and it does. But in the kids in the disorganized attachment group, it started off higher, and then it spiked even higher after the strange situation procedure than the kids in the other group. And then when they had like a play session afterwards, the kids in the other groups, their cortisol went back to normal really quickly. And the kids in the disorganized attachment group, their cortisol took a lot longer to return to normal. So the reason this is an example of like an integrated approach to look at pathology and like psychological disorder is that you're looking at, interaction between parents and their very young children, and seeing how it affects their kids' nervous system. This is what it's affecting is the limbic, hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal axis. Okay, so it starts with the limbic system in the brain. Does anybody know what that part of the brain is most responsible for?
emotional experiences.
Yeah, the limbic system is the guilty party. So, it involves the hippocampus, which is responsible for a lot of things, particularly memory. I always remember that because it starts with a hippo, which is a large animal, which reminds me of elephants. And elephants are supposed to have really good memories. That's how I remember that part of the brain. I mean, I don't have to anymore, but that's, and then what's another? Can somebody name another part of the limbic system that's involved with emotion?
With memory.
Yeah, the hippocampus is definitely involved in memory. Is there another part besides the hippocampus that you guys can name in the limbic system that's associated?
Thalamus.
Amygdala?
What?
The thalamus.
The thalamus. I was thinking of the amygdala. Does anybody know what the amygdala is associated with?
Isn't the amygdala regulate emotion?
Yeah, there's a couple particular emotions it's associated with.
Isn't it like anger?
Yeah, yeah. Anger and fear, which cracks me up because like it's the same first three letters as my name.
Also,
Fear and
Timothy said fear in the chat.
Huh? Oh, somebody said fear in the chat.
Yeah.
I'm not looking at the chat. I gotta get better at that. All right, more chat, and then put it in front of something else. Okay, thank you, Timothy. Yeah, fear and emotional regulation. Yeah. So that's the limbic system, and it kind of controls the hypothalamus, which is kind of like the master kind of not service, like signal center in the brain, and it's in control of the pituitary, which is the master gland. So the master gland controls all the glands, including the adrenal glands, and that's where cortisol comes from. So obviously, if kids with disorganized attachments have elevated, overactive, if they have high levels of cortisol in their bodies, then their limbic, hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal axis is overstimulated, and it looks like it's that way over time. Even it's not just a response to like an instant stressor. It's even when nothing's going on. So early caregiver-child interaction is impacting that child's physiology. And that might impact how they respond to stressors for the rest of their lives, right? So they might be more jumpy, more stressed out, more like sore and tense, further on into their lives, unless they have like, corrective emotional experience, a good long period of time in a good environment. So it's kind of hard to find, people were interested in that, like, can this be reversed, right? Because that's the kind of thing that psychologists like to study. We don't just like to see, oh, this has this negative outcome. Okay, great, we know that now. This causes horrible things, great. The reason we want to know that is so we can prevent things. And so if they've already happened, we can make an intervention so things might be able to get better. But it's really hard to know whether when things go wrong, they're reversible, right? Because you might think, oh, there was some kind of critical period in this kid's biological development that didn't get met with good enough, environmental supports. So now this kid's HPA axis is messed up for life, right? And how do we see if we can fix that kid's HPA axis? And it's hard to find kids who have disorganized attachments and put them into this great enriched environment. Like you would think, oh, great, just find foster homes, you know? But has anybody have any experience with foster homes? Like some of them are great, but a lot of the foster homes that I've seen in working with neglected kids with, emotional problems have been not that much better than their original families that were abusive. A lot of them have been neglectful. A lot of them have been highly critical. So it's not like, because I used to like think I was going to be a hero. And if a kid's home life wasn't really great, I was going to get them out of there and get them into a great home. But then I found out that sometimes I would cause more problems by reporting abuse, because oftentimes the kid wouldn't even get taken out of that environment. And then the parents would be really mad at them, so they'd get beat up worse because they'd find out the kid told on them, so that was that whole thing to deal with. And then if they did get removed from the home, sometimes they'd get put in a situation that wasn't a hell of a lot better, right? Welcome to like burnout, right? Because that can burn mental health professionals out really fast. So it's hard to find a situation where somebody goes from a hellish environment to like a great environment. But that did kind of happen naturally, happily, with Romanian orphans in the really early 90s. The there was a dictator, Ceausescu, and have you guys heard of him? In Romania, and he fell, he fell from his dictatorship at the end of 1989. Okay, so what that meant was, and what he had done is like he had really kind of demanded that people expand the population. He wanted like a big workforce, a big population, and he kind of demanded that people procreate. And what ended up happening is they, wasn't an organized enough country. They didn't have enough resources and people were really poor. And people started like abandoning their kids to orphanages because there were way too many kids, more than the country could take care of. And the country didn't have the resources to have good, well-staffed orphanages. I mean, they were horrible. I'm going to show you a video clip of them. And then when there was some kind of, I forgot where it first appeared. It was some kind of like 2020 episode, one of those shows. And then it was reported in the news a lot. And you could now go to Romania, and tons of people from the United States, and I think Canada too, went over there and adopted these orphans and brought them back and put them in like highly, enriching environments. These were people who, a lot of them were infertile people who really wanted kids and had for a long time. A lot of them were, people who just really wanted to help neglected kids, so you could see, can these kids get better? They've been in a horrible situation and then they went to a great, supposedly great situation. I don't know exactly what every home was like. Okay. So I first, before we talk about the study, I just want to show you what the orphanages in Romania were like.
Sorry, 19
recovered.
Can you
as well
hear
as
it when I
autistic.
mute myself?
There were some medias that actually
Sorry if
found
you can hear me eat
institutions.
my sandwich.
Institutions that were never meant to be discovered by the public or the outside world. It left the world in shock that such conditions even existed.
Those of us who visited these institutions built by the communist regime are unlikely ever to forget them. Hundreds of children not so much cared for as contained.
Well, at the age of 6 months old, I became ill, and my parents took me to a hospital to be treated for my illness. But instead of finding healing at a hospital, I actually ended up being infected with polio. My parents took me to a different hospital in Sigatu Marmatia. They never came back. So the state put me in an institution for handicapped children, an orphanage known as Home Hospital for the Irrecoverable Children.
What's in this room, no one could prepare for. Filthy, dark, and stinking. There's excrement everywhere. These boys are the most difficult cases. They deserve the best of care. Instead, they get the worst.
From the moment that we could remember for ourselves, that's all we knew. We didn't have compassion. We didn't have feelings or emotions. We just existed to just vegetate. You know? We were just wild animals that needed to be caged up, is what we were considered pretty much. I grew up there up until I was 11 years old.
Romania has precious little that the world wants except its children. These are the children soon to start a new life far from their real parents. Some orphanages have been emptied already.
I was adopted by a family in Southern California in San Diego, Marlis and Daniel Racon. It was difficult pretty quickly, actually. I could not adapt into a family environment. My mind was just so used to living in the institution, I was desperate to go back to Romania. I got angry. I became super bitter. I even wrote letters asking the workers if they would let me stay with them till I was 18 years old. Each and every single one of them said no. I went back to Romania in 2001. I went to meet my birth family to search for answers. We also went back to the institution where I grew up. I tried to understand my mom. I tried to get to know her, but unfortunately, not every parent wants to be a parent. If I had never come to America, I would either be on the streets or absolutely dead. There's so many kids who are just kicked out of this, who are kicked out of the system. Every city I went into Romania, or every county, when you see a grown adult sitting or standing, rocking back and forth, or doing something that only an institutionalized person would do, you can instantly recognize that person grew up in an orphanage. I do miss the institution sometimes, and people don't understand that because they've never experienced it. It's what we're used to. That's where we grew up. It's our home.
Okay, so be hard to kind of imagine a more, more impoverished environment than that, right? Oftentimes there'll be one caregiver in the orphanage who's responsible for like 40 kids, 50 kids, 60 kids. And they'll have to like literally tie up with bed sheets a kid who's aggressive to make sure nobody gets injured while they're just cleaning or something. So you can imagine, which attachment group do you think most of the kids are in? Kind of
Disorganized.
Huh?
Disorganized.
Yeah. All right. So again, Megan Gunner decided to do some research because she thought this could give some insight into whether this kind of cortisol dysregulation could be reversed. because so many kids did get adopted into caring families. Okay, some of the problems with kids who've come out of Romanian orphanages and just other places where they've been deprived of good, good food, that kind of thing, Romania and elsewhere, is some end up not achieving normal weight and height. Some girls get early onset puberty. They think that's because of the lack of males, grown males in orphanages, because there's not enough testosterone in the environment to counter the amount of estrogen in the environment. So then people get their menstrual periods earlier. Girls in father absent homes or adult male absent homes get their periods earlier because there's no testosterone in the atmosphere. Okay, what else? Neglect can suppress the growth of the long bones, so like the femur, like the longest bone in the legs. It can change neuroendocrine functioning, meaning the HPA axis, and which is responsible for cortisol. What else? Oh, and IQ. People who are neglected have lower IQs than people who get out of those situations faster, out of neglectful situations like some orphanages faster. So what Megan Gunner did was she compared kids who were 6 to 12 years old after they got out of Romanian orphanages. And she compared ones who had gotten out before they were 4 months old to a group of kids who had spent at least 8 months in the orphanage. And then there was one other group that she compared them to, and it was Canadian-born children who had just been born to their biological families and raised by them. And the kids who had been adopted before they were 4 months old had normal cortisol levels, the same as the Canadian-born children. So just regular Canadian-born kids who were raised by their own biological families. Okay, they were also the same on IQ, normal height and weight, that kind of thing. And then the kids who had spent 8 or more months in the orphanage had dysregulated cortisol systems. They had higher cortisol, just like the kids in the disorganized attachment group that I told you about in the study we just discussed. Okay, so it looks like, yeah, you can reverse this HPA axis dysregulation, this cortisol dysregulation, but you have to get to kids, before they have been there for 8 months. There's some kind of sensitive period. Once they're there for 8 months or more, it's harder to have an impact. Okay. So does any of this surprise you? Does anybody know somebody who came from an orphanage in Romania? No?
I find it interesting that it's 8 months though, because at that age you're still from 0 to maybe even a year or two. It seems like you wouldn't remember any of that at that time because you're still very young. So it's surprising that it's 8 months that is where it starts to be affected, because you don't remember that. time.
Yeah, it says in their first years of life, so it could have been significantly more than 8 months, but 8 months was the cutoff. So it could have been like a 3-year-old who got adopted at, age 3, but had already been there for 2 years. You know what I mean? So yeah, there were some as young as 8 months who had been there as few as 8 months, who had significant difference in their cortisol levels, but the group, there were people who had been there longer. Let me see if there's an average length of stay reported there. I don't know if anyway, I'll look that up, but yeah, it could be that, I'd like to look up how long most of them had been there. But they did report that there was like a clear positive correlation between how long they stayed and how high their cortisol levels were. So like the longer they were there, the more above average their cortisol levels were, which is bad. That's an indication that they're stressed out. Okay. The other thing that cortisol does in babies is like makes them kind of withdraw, because they're scared and stressed out. So they might learn about their environments less, right? Because remember how a child or an animal, that's a juvenile animal, has to be able to use the caregiver as a secure base from which to explore so they can learn about the environment. And if they don't feel safe enough, if they have to cling because they're not sure that parent is reliable, then they're not going to learn enough about their environment. Right? And what's interesting is they've seen that there are really similar effects in animals, really similar long-term impact of early experiences on this HPA axis in animals. So like little animals can be traumatized too. If you deprive infant animals of adequate maternal stimulation, they're hyper responsive to stressors later in life. They secrete more cortisol. If they have a high fever early in life, they have HPA axis effects that mimic maternal neglect. So it's almost like, a form of brain damage caused by a high fever. Let's see. It can cause, if the deprivation is severe enough to cause growth retardation, so that the animal stays small its whole life, then there's usual chronic elevations in cortisol and other like basal activity, but I'm just going to say cortisol because that's what we keep talking about. So you remember Harlow's monkey studies, right? When he compared infant monkeys, preference for terry cloth mothers versus mothers that fed them formula, right? What did they prefer? Or, well, I mean, how did they change the amount of time they spent with each fake mom? Bless you.
They only went to the wire mother for food and then stayed with the cloth mother.
Right. So they go get some food, but then they hang out on the terry cloth one, right? For tactile comfort. But if you put, neither is ideal, right? The ideal one is a real live, mom, right? But rhesus monkeys raised on cloth surrogates only, or only with peers too, like with no parental figure. Let's see, have been shown to have increases in cortisol levels, even when measured in adulthood. Okay. So, I mean, clearly there are environmental effects on these things that we would think are kind of, you know, we used to, especially like when I was in college and grad school, we used to think these things were very set in stone, like that your physiological makeup was what you were born with, which was what was determined by your genes, right? And that there were, yeah, there's your, you know, genotype and your phenotype, like, so who you really like look like and act like might be a little different than what your genes would have suggested, but not in these radical ways, right? So that's further evidence that there's clearly an integration of nature and nurture that determines how healthy we are, right? So does that mean, you know, if you were deprived for 8 months or more in childhood, like your life is over? You know, what would you kind of prescribe for someone who was in a, you know, deprived environment for a long time as a young child? What would you try? If it was your kid, right? You adopted someone and they were kind of hyper vigilant at all times, what would you do, Emily?
Well, maybe just like one thing is to just show them like over and over again that like you care for them and that you'll like always be there for them. Like even if
Yeah.
they try to push you away, like you won't.
Yeah, super consistency, right? So consistency for every kid is good. Just for kids, knowing what to expect is massive. The reason kids have disorganized attachments is because they have parents who are so kind of difficult to predict that they don't know how to behave. They don't know which of those which of those attack bids for, you know, reunion is going to work. If they cry, sometimes they get hit, sometimes they get hugged. So they don't know how to act, right? But when your parent acts the same all the time, you know what to do. That's why kids who had like horrible behaviors that got them kicked out of regular school, who came to the alternative school that I was a clinician in, they would come and our rules were so obvious, you know, and stated all the time really calmly. And we always gave like the lowest level of consequences that we could for any negative behavior, because punishment doesn't work, but positive reinforcement for good behavior does. So we would always go with like the least punitive thing we could do. And after like 2 weeks, people's negative behaviors in school would be down like 40%, 50%, you know, because it was just like they were finally somewhere where you could expect like reasonable behavior and like a reasonable response to somebody messing up a little bit, or, you know, when like somebody is in an environment where you don't know what kind of idiosyncratic ridiculous response the people around them are going to have next. It's hard to like behave responsibly when the world isn't fair, right? So if you make the world totally predictable, people calm down, right? So if you're already an adult, what are you going to do? If you don't have an adult who can like form your world and make it fair, because, you know, in adulthood, it's no longer possible to keep it actually fair. So what are you going to do to calm down your HPA axis? What do you think might work? What do you guys do when you're hypervigilant and traumatized? Self-care. What kind of self-care do you do? Or do
Work
you,
out.
huh?
Work out.
Work out. That's a big one.
Go
And it
for a
works.
drive.
Huh?
Go for a drive.
Go for a drive.
Maybe talk to a counselor or get like a
Counselor.
therapist.
Talk to anyone, right? Anybody like do like Headspace or something? Or just look at that Breathe Lotus thing. Anything else? Yeah, I mean, so there's a million ways to kind of monitor your own sympathetic nervous system, right? And maybe have what Carl Rogers called corrective emotional experiences, where you make sure you're surrounded by people who are fair and reasonable and really, really, you know, reliable and predictable, you know, because you have a choice about that. You can't pick your family, but you can pick your, you know, who you're with in adulthood. All right, well, I'm gonna stop there. So I hope you guys have a great weekend, and I will see you Monday.
Thank you.
Okay, take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thanks.